Imagine standing in the blistering noon heat, yet having no dark shape beneath your feet. This isn't a dream. It's the tragic reality of the greedy herbalist who bartered his shadow for gold. He thought he was outsmarting fate, but he soon learned that even the brightest treasure cannot hide the darkness of a missing soul. Do well to subscribe, like, share, and hit the notification bell. Here we go with the story. There was a time when people spoke of Kwesi with reverence. He had been born into a line of healers. His grandfather had known the secrets of bark and roots. His mother could listen to a fever and hear the plant that would cool it. In their clay-walled compound at the edge of the village, gauze hung from the rafters filled with dried leaves. Bundles of roots rested in shadowed corners. The air always smelled of smoke, rain-soaked earth, and something bitter that hinted at survival. In his youth, Kwesi's hands had been sure and gentle. He crushed leaves against the stone, listening to their fibers tear and release their medicine. He woke before the sun, walked into the forest while mist still clung to the ground, and thanked each tree before he caught anything from it. People came from far-off settlements, haggard and hopeful, bringing small gifts, yams, smoked fish, calabashes of palm wine in exchange for his skill. Back then, when children recovered from coughs that rattled their bones, their mothers touched Kwesi's feet in gratitude. When old men slept easier because their joints stopped burning, they blessed his name into the wind. Then the world shifted. The rains betrayed the village one year. They came too late and left too early. The fields cracked and hardened like old clay. Boils and strange fevers appeared, illnesses Kwesi's ancestors had never taught him to name. At the same time, traders began to arrive with glossy tins and bottles from faraway cities, each bearing colorful labels and impossible promises. Tales that numbed pain instantly, syrups that quiet coughs overnight. People stopped coming to Kwesi first. They went to the trader's store, dazzled by the bright glass that caught the sun. Only when their coins ran out or the medicines failed did a few of them shuffle to Kwesi's door, ashamed and half apologetic, offering less than before, bargaining for his time like he was just another stall in the market. Kwesi watched his herb basket stay full and his food stores shrink. Nights grew longer. The respectful greetings faded into quick nods, or worse, into averted eyes. Even those he had healed began to speak of him with a past tense that felt like a slow burial. He heard whispers that his medicine was old, that the world had moved on, that perhaps the spirits had turned their faces from him. Poverty dragged its fingers over everything he owned. His roof leaked, his clothes stained and frayed. Once, when he walked through the markets, he overheard a woman tell her daughter not to marry a man who worked with leaves, because leaves dried and crumbled, and so did the lives of men who relied on them. Bitterness took roots in him. At first, a small, stubborn seed, then a choking vine. He began to look at the gold rings on the trader's fingers more often than at the faces of his patients. He saw the new compound rising at the center of the village, its walls tall and smooth, its doorway carved, its owner a man who had never stayed up all night grinding bark to keep a stranger's child alive. The world, Kwesi decided, had no mercy for the careful or the humble. It honored only the wealthy. He still knew the prayers. He still knew which leaf suited which wound. But now, when he placed a hand on a patient's forehead, a part of him seated at the thin coins or wheated cassava offered in exchange. A man who had once accepted chickens and gratitude now began to count his losses instead of his blessings. On a day when the heat clung to the earth like a curse, Kwesi walked alone beyond the village, past the last huts and the last tethered goats, into the land where the path divided under a wide, solitary baobab. It was a crossroads. The kind mothers warned their children about at night, places where paths crossed were places where words touched. Spirits, they said, such as liked to bargain with human misery, waited there. He came without offerings or ritual. He came with something harsher, a heart swollen with resentment and a mind rehearsing an accusation against the world. He sat under the baobab for a long time, watching dust shimmer in the air. The sun stood overhead, cruel and unsheltered. He thought of the gleam of gold, the things it could buy, the full storehouses, the respect, the heavy bracelets that turned a hand into a statement of power. He asked himself what he would give to never worry about hunger or humiliation again. The answer rose in him before he could name it, like something whispered into his ear by a mouth that wasn't quite his own. Some say he spoke into the empty air, calling out to any spirit that would listen, promising whatever it wanted in exchange for a life filled with gold. Some say he did not need to call at all. Despair, they say, is its own loud summons. The light around him changed. The shiver in the air felt like the first breath taken inside a grave. Something stood at the other side of the crossroads. It was shaped like a person, tall and thin, draped in a cloth that never stirred, even though the wind now leaked at the baobab leaves. Its feet touched the ground, but underneath them the dust remained the same shade as everywhere else. No darker outline marked its presence. The sun burned straight down, but the figure did not cast a shadow. It was wrong in a way the body felt before the mind understood. Kwesi's skin prickled. His throat dried further. Yet when the figure raised its hand slightly, a suggestion of invitation, another sensation surged to the surface. Hope, feverish and sharp-edged. The spirit offered him exactly what he had imagined and more. Endless gold. Not a handful of coins, not one lucky strike in the riverbed, but a wealth that would never run dry. Wealth enough to build a compound bigger than the chief's, to own the wells, to command labor, to silence any tongue that had ever dared to pity or dismiss him. In exchange, it asked for something he had never thought to value, his shadow. For a heartbeat, he was bewildered. The human mind knows how to measure goats, land, even status, but how does it measure a thing that has followed the body silently since birth, that stretches and shrinks and hides beneath the feet at noon? The spirit made it sound simple. Shano was emptiness, it implied, an outline of darkness that neither fed nor clothed. He could not hold it in his hand or grind it in a mortar. He had never been able to trade it for food. Why mourn what never had weight? A healer's training had taught Kwesi caution with single-sided bargains. Somewhere deep, a warning shivered. Elders had spoken of the shadow as more than a patch of darkness, a twin made of night, a vessel that held what the body could not bear alone, a filter between flesh and unseen forces. But those teachings had faded in him under the drumbeat of hunger and humiliation. Gold, meanwhile, was real. It rang when struck. It gleamed in sun and firelight alike. It commanded attention. It did not dry in drought. He stood at the crossroads, skin slick with sweat, jaw tight. In his chest, something fragile argued feebly for patience, for faith, for the slow rebuilding of trust with his community. Rather than that, something wounded insisted that he had already given enough to a world that took and took. The spirit's presence pressed in around him, heavy as the noon heat. He imagined coins spilling into his hands, the look on the trader's face when he passed by with a gold-weighted step. He imagined never again bowing his head to anyone. When he finally nodded, it felt less like a decision and more like giving in to a current he had been resisting too long. The spirit moved smoothly like water pouring into a hollow. It glided close until it stood directly in front of him, its height swallowing the glare of the sky. For a moment, Kwesi saw them together on the ground, the slim silhouette of the spirit and the broad, familiar shape of his own shadow, side by side, like two pools of ink. Then, with a motion as delicate as plucking a leaf, the spirit bent and took hold of the darkness at his feet. There was resistance, not in the dust, but inside him. The pool tugged something beneath his skin. A tether he had never known was there. Pain fled, sharp and clean, running from the soles of his feet up to the base of his skull. It was not the tearing of flesh. It was the thinning of presence. The sense of being solid wavered, as though a layer of himself had been peeled away. The spirit rose, and with it rose Kwesi's shadow, no longer bound to his heels. It dangled from the spirit's hand, rippling like cloth in water, then coiled into its grasp. The absence at his feet was a pale, raw circle of dust. At that exact moment, the earth heaved. Gold erupted from the ground, like a buried river breaking free. Nuggets the size of his fist tumbled out, followed by smooth, heavy coins that rang against one another. They poured from cracks in the dry earth, from beneath roots, from the very footprints he had left on the path. The baobab stick bark glittered as veins of metal traced up its trunk before retreating into the soil, leaving behind only normal bark and a dizzy, ringing silence. Kwesi stumbled back, blinking against the sudden blaze of reflected light. His breath came fast. His hands plunged instinctively into the shining heap at his feet. It was cold and solid and unreal, like touching sunlight hardened into metal. When he lifted his head again, the spirit was gone. The path lay empty, the crossroads as ordinary as dust, and tree and sky could ever be. Only one thing was different, and he did not yet understand how vast a difference it was. At his feet, under the hammering sun, there was no dark twin lying obediently on the ground. He stood alone, casting no shade at all. He returned to the village, with gold seeping from every fold of his worn clothes. He stuffed his pockets, tied it into cloth bundles that dragged his shoulders down, cradled armfuls of coins against his chest like newborn goats. Every step sent a muted chime through the air. The first people who saw him thought they were dreaming. The second ones smelled metal on the wind, sharp, almost sweet, and followed the sound. By the time Kwesi reached the first row of compounds, a small crowd had gathered, their eyes wide, their mouths half open. Gold that did not belong to chiefs or traders. Gold carried by a man whose heart had always looked on the verge of collapse. The days that followed blurred into a fever. He sold nothing, yet his wealth multiplied. Every time he reached for a coin, there were more beneath it, as if they grew in layers. He gave handfuls away in those first moments, drunk on the power of discarding what others worked lifetimes to collect. He pressed coins into the palms of children who dared come close, into the trembling hands of old women whose backs had been bent by decades of labor. The village shifted around him with greedy grace. Builders arrived, offering their skills. Carvers proposed designs for doors so intricate that anyone passing by would have to stop and admire. Tailors suggested clothes imported from faraway coasts, the wide in colors that made the eyes ache. Those who had once paid him in yams now bowed, calling him master, speaking of his fortune as if it had always been destined. A compound rose at the center of the village with terrifying speed. Walls were smooth and painted a rich ochre. The roof was layered thick with fresh thatch and capped with ornaments that caught the light. The doorway arched high enough for free men to pass through, with their heads unbowed. Inside, rooms multiplied like cells. One space for sleeping, one for eating, another just to hold chests filled with gold and objects bought only because they were expensive. Kwesi walked through all of it with a tight, burning satisfaction. Each beam and carved post whispered a single message. He had won. He replaced his threadbare wrappers with cloth that shone in the sun. Gold circled his wrists. his neck, his fingers, until his own body became a moving altar to his new allegiance. Men who once avoided his compound now brought disputes to him, seeking the judgment of a wealthy man. Young women watched him from the corners of their eyes with a complicated mixture of fear and calculation. Yet, underneath the roar of his triumph, something else began to stir. The first time it happened, he was crossing the main square at noon. The sun hung high, white and merciless. People moved back as he walked, parting around him in a widening arc, their chatter dimming. On any other day, the ground would have been crowded with overlapping shadows of huts and people, of kids and animals. That day, from the center of the square, someone gasped softly. Kwesi followed their gaze downward. There was his body, wrapped in bright clothes, laden with gold, and beneath it, nothing. The earth was the same pale, dust-beaten surface as everywhere else. No shape clung to his heels. No dark echo lay sprawled at his feet. For a moment, his head swam. The image felt like an illusion caused by the glare. He shifted, half expecting a delayed, skittering outline to hurry and catch up. The dust remained uniform, mercilessly exposed. Around him, people shuffled backward. The gap between him and the nearest villager widened. Mothers angled their bodies, placing children behind their legs in one uncertain motion. A boy, bold or ignorant, bent slightly as if to see better, then straightened so quickly he almost stumbled. Words floated to him in fragments, scraps of thought escaping the careful cages of whispers. Not right. No shadow. Under the sun, one must have a shadow. Spirit touched. Caused. He lifted his chin, swallowing down a tremor that had nothing to do with pride. He pretended not to see the way their eyes flicked from the coins on his neck to the emptiness on the ground. In the days that followed, the village learned to live with two truths pressed uneasily together. On one side stood the glittering fact of his wealth. His house employed more servants than anyone else's. He bought entire harvests with a gesture, stored the best of everything in cool rooms carved from packed earth. Musicians played at his feasts. Travelers spoke of him down the river, naming him among the richest men they had ever seen. On the other side loomed the unsettling reality that he cast no shadow. People adjusted their movements to avoid walking beside him. They found excuses to be elsewhere when he passed at midday. Some refused to attend his feast if they were held during full daylight, claiming obligations in the fields that could not be delayed. At night, they said, all shadows were swallowed into one. It was safer there. Children dared each other to peek at him from behind walls, to see whether moonlight recognized him any better than the sun did. They swore his feet never quite seemed to sink into the dust the way everyone else's did, as if an invisible layer stood between him and the earth. Animals knew before humans admitted it. Goats tugged at their tethers, eyes rolling white when he approached. Dogs slunk away, tails pressed tight. Birds took sudden, explosive flights from roofs when his steps sounded beneath them, even if he never raised a hand. At first, Kwesi laughed in private at their fear. Let them whisper, he thought, tossing another coin into a growing chest. Let them fear what they did not understand. Fear, after all, was another kind of power, but slight discomforts began to creep into the edges of his days, then into their center. He woke one morning, feeling as if he had slept directly on heated stone. His skin tingled, then burned, as if he had been lying under the midday sun, not in the cool interior of his new house. When he stepped outside, the sensation intensified. It was not like normal heat, which rested on the surface and could be wiped away with water and shade. This sank deeper, slipping under his skin, lodging in his bones. He moved from patch of light to patch of shade, seeking relief. Under the eaves of his roof, where others sighed with comfort, the burning did not lessen. Standing beneath the great neem tree in his courtyard brought no coolness. The leaves trembled above him, casting patterns on the ground, but where he stood, the earth remained raw, unsharrow. He realized then, with a slow dawning horror, that it was not the world that failed to offer shade. It was him who could no longer receive it. The talking drum rests here. Watch out for part 2 if you enjoyed this folktale. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you can be notified when we publish the next story. Don't forget to tell us in the comment section what you've learned and done where you are watching from. Your voice matters here.